Now, on to our presentation. First, a thank you to our presenter, Ms. Sylvia Parath. She is the director of the Elder Justice Unit in the Office of the Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. She has extensive experience in the area of elder justice to include hands-on elder abuse investigations, training, advocacy, and policy development. During this presentation, we understand that our presentation is based on some of the laws and the regulations that are in the state of Ohio. We'll be looking at that and addressing some different resources that you can utilize if you are joining us from another state or perhaps outside of the continental United States. Sylvia has been very gracious, and she's provided us with a number of resources and also said that she is available if you all have individual questions. So without further ado, let me introduce Sylvia, and she can get started with our presentation. Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us. We truly appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. So I will quit sharing my screen and let you take over.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm glad to see that we have several participants who are interested in learning about this topic, and it's a timely. So before I jump in, can you is the correct? Can you see my slides? Is my elder abuse hidden victims slide showing?
I am seeing it.
Okay,
Yep,
you are. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I always like to be. It's always nice to have some fun validating. As Michelle mentioned, I do work for the Ohio Attorney General's office, but you need to know that I'm not an attorney. I know lots of them because I work with many of them. I was recruited for this position because I have expertise in older adults. So I'm actually a social worker for many years as a geriatric case manager, social worker, worked with folks in the communities, and eventually ended up specializing in elder abuse, and did that for a few years before I came to the office. So in my role at the Elder Justice Unit, Michelle taught me a term yesterday that I'm an integrator. When folks call our office, typically it's because they're trying to navigate around the issues of they know someone, or they might even be a professional who's struggling with how to investigate and how to work with other partners. But because in Ohio, we have a very fragmented elder justice system, which meaning we don't have a one-stop shop. So the age of the victim, how old they are, where do they live? Are they in the community? Are they in a facility? Who's the bad guy? As I say, the perpetrator, family member? Is it a professional? Does a person have any vulnerabilities? Are they intact? These things can affect, and you'll learn more about today, can affect who's going to investigate. There's a lot to remember. So one of the resources that I provide is us, because some of you may work with individuals, some of you may have family members that you're concerned about, or a church member or an acquaintance, and you're trying to help them. You might end up reaching out to us about a specific case and try to figure out, based on that case, what would be a good solution. So that's how I'm work in my office. I don't investigate cases anymore. In my prior life, I was APS chief of Adult Protective Services in Cuyahoga County for 10 years, which is where I learned a lot of the bulk of my knowledge around elder abuse. But I do have my contact information, and you'll be able to follow up with me. So obviously, I just was curious. We have a chat, and I know I have a lot of you in the audience that I'm curious what is important for you today, because we're going to be covering, as an overview, we're going to touch on a lot of things. I'm going to give you an idea of what's needed in these cases to investigate. What are some of the challenges, because you're working with adults, as well as some of the strategies investigators use. So if you don't mind, drop in your chat some of the things that you're interested in, that would help me just to make sure that I'm meeting your needs as your trainer. And Michelle, you're going to help me manage the chat?
Yes, as long as I can keep control of my mute button.
Okay.
But yes, I will.
Okay.
So it looks like we have one comment in the chat, which is protecting elderly and giving resources and information. So there's a comment for you.
Okay, thank you.
I can hear someone trying to talk, but it's not coming through very well. So if you could please mute yourself and type it for us, that would be great.
It might be Chrome isn't muted, and it was creating some background. Do you want your audience to be able to unmute and talk, or you prefer they use the chat?
I think we're better off with the chat.
Okay.
So if you all would please use the chat, that would be great. It looks like we have another comment, which is how to identify elder abuse.
Okay, I think we're going to cover that for sure.
And how to combat the numerous scammers that get money from elders who think everyone is honest.
That's going to be harder. Hopefully, and today we're focusing mostly on elder abuse, which may or may not include the scams, and we'll talk more about that. And we'd appreciate if everybody mutes because there is some background noise that's coming through. So I'm going to go ahead. I think we're going to cover a lot of these things, and hopefully by the end of the it's a 45, we're going to hopefully speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So it's an overview. So you need to know that I do a lot of these presentations all over Ohio, and some of these require a full day training on their own, but hopefully you'll have a better idea. And if you do want more training, that's clearly we can figure that out. Michelle can reach out to me and we can do more webinars if you're interested in this subject matter. So today I'm going to give you a better idea. I call them indicators. What are the signs and symptoms? So when should I be concerned? What are the warning signs? And so hopefully after today, you'll have a better sense of that. And then, so what kind of abuses are we talking about? And then we're going to spend a little bit of time because tomorrow, I don't know if you all know, but tomorrow is Elder Abuse Awareness Day. It's actually a day that started as a world internationally in June 15. It's recognized as a World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. It started in Europe, I think when United States adopted it to recognize the day in proclamation and legislation to recognize it back when President Clinton was in office. And in Ohio, when my former boss, our governor, when he was an AG, he has some legislators and they worked together with Mike Davila, who was a local House representative, on making sure Ohio recognized. So in Ohio, we also recognize June 15th annually as a day to recognize and honor victims of elder abuse and to help, to educate about the situation. So we'll talk about adult protective services and as well as some of the amendments to the laws that have taken place. So I like to start with this slide because it kind of gives us content. What are we talking about? What is it? And one of the things that, I've been at this profession for a long time. Matter of fact, the first part of my career, I would have considered myself a mandatory reporter because I was a community-based social worker and I worked in the community. And one of the things that I remember being told that as a social worker, I was a mandated reporter. And there's actually quite a few professions that are in Ohio mandatory reporters, but Ohio's law actually allows anyone to make a report to APS, and it should all be treated the same. But I remember that I wasn't really told what that meant, and so I think with some of the enhancements that we have to the laws, it's a good opportunity for all of us to go back and review and learn, because I have a feeling there's a whole lot of professionals here that have this responsibility but don't know it. The problem's getting bigger, not smaller. As many of you may not be aware, but most states in the United States, the older population is growing, and in Ohio is no different. Matter of fact, as a state, our older adults, 60 and older, comprise about 25% of our population, and that number is expected to rise. And then you compass with the fact that we have more older adults, and we have more older adults living longer. So with our vulnerabilities comes and increases the probability or the likelihood of becoming a victim. So that's why right now we are estimating that 1 in 10 older adults older than 60 is a victim, and we don't know about it. The part that scares me the most is that we have a whole lot of abuse going on, but very little of it is being reported to authorities. So when I was a young social worker, we used to say 1 in 5 case went undetected. Now we're looking, and experts are saying that it's really as much as high as 1 in 25 case that's being brought to the attention to authorities. And one of the things that I'd like to tell people is when you're calling in an authority, you're creating the opportunity to stop it. One of the things that we're going to talk about is why sometimes it doesn't work, and why does it still continue after you reported it. So one of the things we're going to talk about today are some of the challenges that working with adults in America. Adults have rights, they have civil rights. With that comes the responsibility of making choices, and they have the right to make choices. So when do you honor their choice? When do you supersede that with protecting them? That's a little complicated, but you're going to learn more about it today. So as I mentioned, the problem is getting bigger, not smaller, and the losses suffered is tremendous. There's a stat that says the United States of America is facing about more than $39 billion losses associated with financial exploitation. And so they're looking at the loss to the individual, but also the loss to the community. So what we know about, if you're a victim of elder abuse, this is a scary stat. The first time I read it, I thought it was a misprint. You're 300 times more likely to die than a non-victim. 300 times. That's crazy. You're also, because you've been victimized, you suffer mental health issues, depression. You might need support services. You might have hospitalization. So you're more likely to need a trip to the emergency room. You're more likely to need medical care. So they're looking at all that, coming up with the cost of all that to the individual and to the community when there's been a loss. It's up to almost $40 billion. That's a big loss. So how can we stop it? It's really takes I say it takes a village. It's really about everybody's business, and that's why having talks like this is really important, because the more we know about identifying the problem, the more likely we are to try to stop it. Here's another study that was done in 2011, so it's been a minute, but it was done up in New York. This study specifically just looked at the likelihood of an exploitation case being reported. And when we talk about exploitation cases, it broadens it, because someone mentioned they want to learn more about scams. When we're dealing with a perpetrator who does not have a personal relationship with the individual, or is not even a real person, or is not living in Ohio and they're somewhere else, it's very challenging to identify and stop when we know the bad guy, we'll say the bad guy because I call him lots of things, isn't someone that we can find and put and understand where they're at so we can stop it. And if they're abroad, we often in these cases end up working closely with the FBI when it's across state lines, as well as making reports to the Secret Service, because if they're somewhere else. But it's the scary stat for this is 1 in 43. So as I mentioned to you, I like this slide because it shows you an iceberg. We're really just dealing with the tip of the iceberg. We know for a fact this problem is much bigger than we're recognizing. And with the pandemic, it actually got worse. Here in the pandemic, we were told to go home and be safe at home. Well, what we actually created was a whole set of victims for the perpetrators. So you told people who were connected to their families, their social network, the senior center, the meal sites, their programming, places that they went to socialize and be protected. We told them, no, you can't do that right now. You have to be safe. You got to go home. So what we let them at home, isolated with the fear of the pandemic. Well, guess who knew it? The bad guys knew it. So we're one of the things that we're learning as Ohio opened back up is that there's a lot of people who during the pandemic were actually victimized, some by scammers and then some by family members. People lost their jobs, people lost their homes, so they moved in with their elderly relative. So we're learning that a lot of folks who were protected and weren't being victimized were taking advantage in the pandemic, and we're just dealing with it now. So it is a problem. So reporting it is the first step to solving the problem. I'm a social worker, and one of the things that I learned as a social worker is that you have to identify a problem before you can solve it. So that's why it's so critical for us to talk about this underreporting problem, and to all of you be more aware of, well, who do I call and what do we do? Because we're really trying to identify the problem earlier. I used to tell people I like little problems too. Identify it earlier and then try to get the case pointed in the right direction. We also do a fair amount of training to seniors and older adults, because we want to teach them not to become a victim. But if they do, we want them to feel comfortable and let us know. So why don't adults report? Why don't professionals report it? In this slide, we're looking at professionals first. We have this mandatory reporting law, and it pretty much tells us you're supposed to make the call. And why don't they? A lot of it has to do with, because we're dealing with adults, people get confused with the signs can be subtle. If I'm working with someone who may have bruises, but I know they're taking medications that could cause bruising, or that as you get older, your skin can get thinner and it can tear. So maybe it happened because you're moving your chair, for instance, and you rip your skin, and it wasn't that someone did it. So sometimes we get confused about, is it abuse, or is there a reason for this? Does it make sense? And then the biggest one that I hear all the time, well, they're adult, they can make these choices. And in the Adult Protective Service law, it doesn't say anywhere in the language, if you think the person's competent, you don't have to make the report. It basically tells you, if you believe or you suspect you see something, say something. Whether the person's competent will affect the investigation. Do they want help? Do I need to go to court? But it doesn't alleviate the mandatory reporter's responsibility just because you're dealing with an adult. The one thing I'll tell you right now, and it's huge, is that if you ask the victim, they're going to deny it. And I'll explain to you in a second, but the victims may deny it because they don't even know, they're not aware. They may have capacity issues, mental health issues, or they've been lied to. That happens all the time. People lie to the victim to get them to provide the money. And basically, when you interview victims, which is one of the things we do when we investigate, is try to find out under what circumstances did they consent. And we'll talk more about it, but it's because they were lied to. Or we don't know who to call. I just told you Ohio has a very fragmented system. So is this case should be reported to Adult Protective Services? Should I involve the police, domestic violence, mental health? Are they in the facility? Do I involve the ombudsman? All that, I don't know who to call, so I'm not going to call anyone. So it's very unclear. And many don't have faith in the government. So I don't know how many times I've heard, I'm not calling APS. I've called them and reported to them, and nothing happened in the past. And that actually makes me a little crazy. And then the last one is, sometimes people think they need permission. I need to let this person know I'm calling, and that's not necessarily true, especially if you're a mandated reporter. You're obligated to make the call, and the consent of your victim to make the call is not needed. And that's important. So this can affect, and that's one of the reasons why the reporting numbers are so high. Why victims don't call, a lot of this is related to our culture and ageism. Too many times the adult thinks, if I tell you this is happening, you're going to blame me, or you're going to think that it's me, that I'm crazy, or something's going on, or somehow I'm going to suffer because somebody's hurting me, but somehow I'm going to lose my independence. You're going to say, I can't live in my house anymore. You're going to put me in a nursing home. So older adults sometimes don't share when they're having problems, especially abuse, because they think that somehow it's going to impact them and they'll lose their independence, or we're not going to believe them. Sometimes they don't know they've been, as I mentioned to you earlier, if they've been lied to, or if they have capacity issues, meaning that at this point, it's easier to trick and deceive them, because at this point their memory has been affected, or they have some executive functioning going on. So we know that people who have cognitive related impairments are 50% more likely to be taken advantage of than someone who's not. So all of these things. Oh, and lastly, many of our older adults are dependent on their perpetrator. I've had folks who, just will let someone come. I need someone to help me, to take care of me. You need a job. Say, hey, why don't you come live with me? And I'll give you free room and board, and you just have to provide care. So there's a lot of times that they allow the wrong person to assist them. So those are some of the reasons why people don't report. So I'm just curious, we've got several people. I'm just curious if any of you have had experiences making reports, either through work or at home, where you're trying to reach Adult Protective Services or another authority, law enforcement, to make a report, what has been your experiences? If somebody's either want to drop in the chat. I know that, and maybe after today, you'll have a better idea of if you're making a report. Michelle, I can't see the chat for some reason.
So
I just see a number.
I was gonna read you the chat, and
Okay.
we have one comment that says yes several times, and it was always unfounded, never had a case opened by APS. Another person said negative, and then another individual noted that nothing was done.
Nothing was done.
And one more comment saying law enforcement only gets involved until the elderly person tells them to go away, denies any abuse. So those are your comments. Police did not help and APS did not help. So it looks like there are some folks that have had some experience and they haven't had a positive outcome for them.
And hopefully today, because one of the things I'm going to cover is what information you need when you make a report. I think sometimes cases are screened out because we don't have enough information. And I think understanding what the APS law in Ohio, what's required, and it's a little different from state to state, for instance, and we'll talk more about that. But I know it's confusing. Some of it, the reasons the case was screened out. First of all, one of the things I'll share with you right now is APS records, Adult Protective Service records, are not public records. So you're not going to know. The one thing you're able to say or ask, and I always tell people when they're making a report to ask if the case is being screened in, because the only question that Jobs and Family Services, who oversees APS, allows them to tell is whether the case is screened in or not. And so it's important to ask that question. So before you hang up, because they'll get back to you and let you know. Sometimes the worker can tell you, but sometimes in a majority of the counties, the supervisor is making that decision. But you want to ask that question, is a case being screened in?
So Sylvia, what I was going to ask, and it just popped up in the chat, is could you let everyone know what screened in is? It's the opposite of screened out, but what does that mean when we're looking at a case?
So screening in means that when you call in a case, you're when you're reporting or you're making a report, APS has to decide based on your information whether the case is going to be accepted for investigation or not. So if it's being screened in, that means that they're accepting the case to go forward with an investigation. That's what that means. But
and then you also have a response, I think, a little bit to the question earlier, and then I'll let you get on through your slides. But there was a comment placed that the doctor actually reported APS came out, but the person being abused was present with their abuser, and APS did not see what was occurring. So, and if I remember your slides correctly, as we move through that, that's something that I think that you have some information on. So
I think I'll cover that. And this
perfect.
But that, Michelle, is why I always say calling it creates an opportunity. What happens next will depend on a lot of things.
Sure.
And the first thing, the adult has the right. So the way the APS law is written, the adult has the right to accept services or refuse services. And we're going to talk more about that.
Okay.
So
I'll mute again.
Okay. It's a little easier to protect children because by law, children are considered incompetent legally. And I know some of you that have teenagers are going to tell me, well, they seem to they seem to think they have the right to say no. But in the court system, the legal capacity and competency is actually assumed. And so APS has a much higher bar because you're dealing with an adult who's presumed competent to protect an individual who does not understand or want protection can be very challenging. And we're going to talk more about that. And please, if I didn't answer your question, ask me again. So Ohio has a reporting structure, and I just want to give you an idea why I have a job and why we have to help people navigate. So we have several folks that are authorities that are available in Ohio to report. So I mentioned to you that it matters where the person lives. So Ohio is in our legislation, so the APS law was written in 1981. We decided and made a very conscious decision when we wrote the law that we were going to be focusing on abuse of older adults in the community. And so the way a lot of states do not have this limitation. So some of you who work in another state, many APS in other states has the authority to investigate facility abuse. We do not. So and I know that's challenging because I obviously know that there's abuse and exploitation occurring in assisted livings as well as nursing homes. I know that. I get the calls in my office because we have to look for other resources when that's going on. So APS law is going to focus mostly on adults in the community. So if the person's living in assisted living or in a facility, I'm going to probably guide those people to seek out their regional long-term care ombudsman, especially if it's family or resident abuse. If they're living there, all facilities are licensed by the Ohio Department of Health. So if the bad guy, I'm going to call him the bad guy, is a staff person, for instance, I'm going to report that to the health department because I know that they oversee that facility and they license the facility and they can get involved in that, or whether the person should be removed or have sanctions. But they also have a responsibility to provide enough supervision and protection. So maybe it wasn't a staff person, but a family member or someone else did it, but they can be helpful. My office, oh, I'm sorry, you gonna say something?
Sylvia, yeah, there was just a comment, and I think we are particularly guilty of doing this in our jobs, particularly the federal government. Could you just go ahead and use the full name of, for example, APS? I know that's Adult Protective Services,
right?
But some of our audience is not familiar with any of the acronyms that you're using. So
Okay.
if you could just do that for us, that would be great.
I will do that. I'll say Adult Protective Services or the Long-Term Care Ombudsman, or the Department of Health. Like I said, I use them a lot if the person is a resident. In my office, so the AGO is the Ohio Attorney General's office. The only section in our office that has original jurisdiction is the healthcare fraud unit. So if I'm getting, if I learn that the person is a resident and they're either being if they're being there's an allegation of misappropriation of funds or patient abuse, they're the only ones that doesn't need to be invited. They can take that on. So I typically refer, if I get a call like that, I typically always include them and let them review the case to see if it meets the criminal, because the healthcare fraud is like doing a criminal investigation. They're looking for prosecution at the end of their case. And of course, local law enforcement has the authority to investigate cases if they believe there's been any criminal exploitation or patient abuse or in the community. The tricky part with making a report to law enforcement, and I saw it in the chat already, is that we really need it's going to be a lot easier for us to file a police report on behalf of a victim who is willing and wants to file charges. It becomes a little bit more complicated. And actually I do a lot of training around it to law enforcement, is when the client is either unwilling or isn't able to file charges. So one of the things when we work with law enforcement is to teach them about evidence-based prosecution. And you all know that in a homicide case, is the victim filing charges? Are they involved? No, they're following the evidence so putting cases together involving older adults when we believe a criminal act took place, there needs to be a lot of education about how do you build that case with either having a victim who's working against you because they don't want to file charges on their family member, or they just don't understand. So you're using the same principles, and we have a lot of training specifically targeted to law enforcement. And there's a course at the Attorney General has the OPATA, which is the Law Enforcement Academy. We do a lot of training there for them. But I wanted to give you an idea of the structure, and it is complex. And if you don't remember anything else today, and if you're dealing with a case, this is where a lot of folks end up calling the Elder Justice Unit, and we ask questions about the case and the specifics is because we're trying to figure out, based on that situation, where do we think it's best suited for? Is it going to be an area in my office, or am I going to be working closely with one of the local adult protective services? Or maybe I think there's a guardianship issue that should be addressed by probate court. So so that's why I think we're really good at connecting people to the best resource. So So I'm going to talk to you a little bit. So that's kind of the landscape, but today I was asked to talk a little bit more specifically about adult protective services. So it is limited in Ohio with the Ohio Revised Code 5101.60. There's a lot of similarities across states about the authority of adult protective services, but there's also differences. And so basically the one thing we have in common across every state is that we typically investigate allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So typically when someone's making a report, the problem has to be occurring. It's not, it's not that like sometimes it's premature, like someone, like a hospital discharge, for instance, the person is refusing to go to a facility and they're going to go home with services that they've agreed to, but they don't think they're going to work. That case would probably be screened out. APS is Adult Protective Services is probably going to tell the person that the home care agency accepting the referral is going to have to make the referral because they're going to need to know whether or not those services are working or not. So sometimes the timing of the case is very important. This is a civil investigation. The main job of Adult Protective Services is not to hold the bad guy accountable. The main job of Adult Protective Services is to find out, is this allegation that you called in actually occurring? So their job is to find out, is this really happening? And to find out the root causes of it, because they're going to try to put services in place to prevent it. So the focus is on, does the person need protection? And then what kind of services are available? I will tell you that those services range from county to county because you're dependent on the resources in your county. So, you know, what kind of resources do you have? What kind of waiting lists are there? Do you have services that the person is publicly available for? So are they eligible for Medicaid? So they're eligible for the waiver program, or do they have funds and now they have to purchase private funds, but they don't want to? So this is when it starts getting complicated. It's like you can have APS, Adult Protective Services, can validate a case. They believe it's occurring, but they're not. But the services that are being offered may not be available, or how are we going to get them? But you also have the client who has the right, all through the APS law, the adult has the right to accept services or refuse services. And then the law says if they refuse services, that doesn't necessarily mean they're incapacitated. So it's basically honoring their civil rights and the right to make choices, even bad choices. So the only time Adult Protective Services can force services, they don't have that authority. They actually, not like child services, because child services, the child doesn't have the legal right to refuse. In this situation, the adult does. So basically, for me to trump that, I have to have proof that I can take to court to show that this person is incapacitated and they are experiencing abuse, neglect. So there is a protective need and they're refusing services. So I haven't gotten them to consent. So I'm basically presenting the case to the judge or magistrate. And most Adult Protective Services work with the prosecutor where they put this together. And it's a court hearing. The adult has the right to be present. The adult has the right to tell them their side of the story. They even have the right to have legal counsel, and one gets afforded to them if they can't afford it. So I don't know if any of you have ever been to a hearing, but it's just like a guardianship hearing where the adult has the right to go and prove that they don't need protective services. So I always used to tell people when I was an adult protective chief in Cuyahoga County, if we got a protective service order, a lot of work went into that, and I needed them to understand and respect it. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes it looks like APS did nothing, is that you may be dealing with an adult who is refusing services. And in the beginning, the case, they may not have evidence. I remember my prosecutors used to tell me all the time, I can't take your evidence to court. I mean, I can't take your instincts to court. I got to take evidence. Find me the evidence.
Sylvia, a question occurred to me. Is there, at this point in time, is there some advocacy, or is there a case manager or a social worker that's part of looking at what kinds of services would be necessary in advocating on behalf of the adult?
So the person that's investigating the case, so the Adult Protective Service worker who is assigned the case would be there would be the main job to go out once the case is accepted, it's screened in, the case gets assigned to a worker who then has to initiate the investigation, and they're the ones that are charged with, you know, did you get in? And because, by the way, that is often the first problem. The older adult won't open the door, and if they don't open the door, APS, Adult Protective Services, would actually need to petition the court to get in, and they need evidence. And so sometimes it's the first time I got the case, I don't have evidence, I don't know who does. Many times I'll turn back to the person who made the report because maybe they have evidence that would help me get a court order. But one of the most, I remember I had a case when I was in Cuyahoga. The guy was, he was hoarding, the bad guy was doing two things. She was abusing my older adult. He was very neglected. She was also neglecting animals. And we were having a hard time getting in because they weren't opening the door. I found out, I reached out to the animal protective worker who was able to get in because cats don't have civil rights. He was able to get an order to get into the house, but what he saw in the house was horrified. He was so horrified that he actually reached back out to us, meaning our office, because he saw our older adult in the home, and he saw the conditions of the home. He became our evidence, and with him, so he didn't have the authority, but we did. So we subpoenaed him, and he was able to provide our judge with the evidence that we needed to get that gentleman out of the house. So the court orders that I'm talking about here are very specific and unique to Adult Protective Services, and it's what makes them very unique. So the majority of our victims don't know that you're calling us, and our first step when APS goes out to the door and knocks on the door, they're hoping that you're going to open the door. Because if they open the door, then they can launch the investigation and they can introduce themselves and what's going on. They're not allowed to tell them who made the report. That information remains protected. It's never disclosed. Even the adult themselves cannot find out who made the report while the case is being investigated. But oftentimes, that's why I'm saying when it looks like APS didn't do anything, did it get screened in? It got screened in. Did they knock on the door? Did they let them in? Did they let them launch the investigation? And the way the law is written, the adult can stop cooperating at any point. So sometimes people work with you and then they find out what you're after. Oh, okay, I don't want this help, go away. So there's lots of opportunities because of their civil rights and for them to stop. So the job of APS worker is trying to do both. I have to tell you your rights. At the same time, I'm trying to tell you that why I'm there and why I'm investigating. Now, not who reported it, but why I'm there is part of the rights to tell the person why you're there. So it's very complex. But the one thing I want to focus on in terms of the duty to report is we want people to call in cases with as much information as possible in terms of why you think it's occurring. So what did you see? What did they report? Are you seeing someone losing weight? Are you seeing mail piling up? Are you seeing garbage piling up? They say that hoarders, that it's bad inside if you're seeing stuff outside. And I know hoarding is becoming a very big problem in just about most communities. So we want you to be telling us, because you have reasonable cause. So you have a suspicion, you believe based on what you observed, what you heard, that something is occurring, that we're going to want you to call it in. But the more specific you can be, the better. And then in the ORC, it basically tells the mandated reporter that you need to report it as soon as you suspect it to your Department of Jobs and Family Services. And this is the ORC where it's written. There's been some enhancements recently in the Ohio law. We've added, I'll show you that in a second, but we've added a bunch of people, new mandatory reporters that work out there. So, but the other nice thing about Ohio, and this is not true in every state, but Ohio allows anyone can make a report. And if you're making it on good faith, everyone, whether you're a mandated reporter or a neighbor, but if you're calling on APS on behalf of someone, you're immune from civil liability unless you've acted in malicious purpose. Malicious is that you're the harm to, there's an intent to harm. And that happens, believe it or not, from time to time with family members. We used to get cases that multiple people were calling in because they were trying to get each other in trouble. The truth was they were all trying to steal mom's mom, but we picked up on that. But Michelle, were you going to say something?
Just a quick question. ORC, that's
Ohio Revised Code.
Okay.
So that's a legislation code. So it's a statute. So
that's the law.
That's the law.
Okay.
So when you see that on here, I'm providing you the details of that it's actually written in the statute.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So here's the list that I was telling you about. It was added. So Ohio had a very basic list of mandatory reporters since 1981, social workers, attorneys, clergy, the dentists. It was most of the healthcare providers. But we added this another 16 categories, and it went into the Ohio Revised Code. So it was in legislation. It was added in September 29 of 2018. We added pharmacists, which you can imagine with all the opioid epidemics and value of those medicines and medications. I know a lot of older adults, people were stealing their opioid medication because it had street value. But dialysis technicians, the mental health hospitals, that's what a hospital, 512201, those are folks that work in mental health hospitals. The health department, which is a huge addition. And as I mentioned, I can't think of one community that isn't dealing with hoarding and those type of sanitation. And what's really new now has been added is paying attention to animal abuse, because there's a lot of good research suggesting people who are cruel, abusive to animals at an early age can grow up to be very destructive individual. And there's a connection between domestic violence, elder abuse, and even mass murders when folks have started at a young age and if they were abusing animals. So that's a new law that passed that requires animal protective sanitation work, animal protective workers to make referrals. They're now new mandated reporters. Firemen, and I like how they finally added paramedics. Talk about a first responder and what they see. So now they're actually required, if they go out and they see a case and it just doesn't look good, to make a report to Adult Protective Services. And the big industry was the banking industries, not just banks, but savings and loan, credit union. So right now we have a booming of referrals to Ohio, and I can't think of one county that isn't experiencing more reports on exploitation, because we added that category, and investment advisors. So I think we have a pretty extensive list now of who needs to be calling APS. But again, anyone can make the report, and whoever makes the report is protected.
Sylvia, I have another question in the chat box, which is why APS does not involve the person contacting them to assist in the evidence.
Well, that's a good question, and that might be local to the county you're working with, and it's something you can maybe reach out to me, because I'm kind of a APS. I know the legislation very well, because not only I work as an advocate, I did the work for over 10 years. I also am a certified instructor for the Jobs and Family Services for APS workers, Adult Protective Service workers. So I know that in the law, section 5101.65 in the investigation, APS worker is supposed to be contacting the person who made the report. Now, when you made the report, you want to make sure you didn't make it anonymously, because if you did, you have the right to make it anonymously. But if you leave your name and number, the law does say that they're supposed to be consulting with the reporter. Your relationship with them is a little different than anyone else. So if you're having that problem and it happens routinely and you're in Ohio, you might want to call me, and maybe we can figure out a way of working with your counties, because that's something they should be doing.
So, and I'll just remind everyone that Sylvia's information will be on the last slide. And I'll also put it in the chat box in a few minutes so that you can contact her if you have a particular specific question. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Michelle. So here's what I wanted to tell you, because I'm telling you, I want to encourage you to make the report with as much information as possible. I'm actually going to encourage you not to make an anonymous report, because I know if you do it that way, they're not going to be able to reach back out to you. But there is a penalty for if you're a mandated reporter that's listed in the law that I just showed you. If and it's discovered that you did not make a report and you should have, there's a penalty that right now for adult abuse, it could be a fine up to $500. There's some pending legislation that's been introduced in Ohio. It's sitting in committee right now, so it's not there. But what we're trying to do in Ohio is elevate the penalty to be the same as the penalty for not reporting child abuse. So there's a movement right now to make it a 4th-degree misdemeanor, which could include a fine and up to a month in jail. But I do not think this is why people don't report. I think it has more to do with not understanding the indicators. I think most people call because they're concerned about an older adult. I don't think people call because they think there's a potential fine. I don't. But I wanted you to know that it is there, and I wanted you to know that there's a movement to try to strengthen it. So when I say abuse in Ohio, when we use the term abuse, we're encompassing physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. When I use the word neglect in Ohio, neglect is basically, it can involve a second person. So we use the term caretaker. That's someone who has accepted the role of responsibility of providing care. They've accepted it. It's not just because they have a daughter or husband who lives there. It's someone who says, I want to take this on, and then doesn't, that we can label them and investigate them for potential neglect. For self-neglect, it's when there is no other person. It's me, and I'm not providing for myself, and I'm putting myself in danger. Someone's come up to the house and offered me services, and I refused them, even though I had means to do it or didn't want to follow through on a Medicaid application. So I'm my own worst enemy in a self-neglect case. Abandonment was added to the Ohio law. This is something that was added in 2018. Abandonment is when I have a caretaker who chose to be a caretaker, and this person gets overwhelmed and just leaves without taking any proper steps or notifying anyone, and they leave someone. And this person is dependent on that person. They might be bed bound or wheelchair bound. And so now you've left a very frail individual without services. That could be labeled abandonment, and it's a form of neglect. Financial, and that's new in Ohio, and we're starting to see more cases and allegations of abandonment. And financial, we don't actually in Ohio, we typically just say exploitation, because in Ohio, it's not just the elders' monies and funds. You can exploit the individual. And that happens more than we realize, that the person's being exploited, kind of like human trafficking, or they get the person to do it because it's an older person. So we don't use the term financial. We use the term exploitation, which encompasses both financial as well as person. Of these, which do you think is the most common? Physical abuse, which is intentionally wanting to inflict harm on someone. Which one? Sexual abuse is any type of engaging in any kind of without consent, and so that could be. Those are hard cases to investigate, and I'll be honest with you. Most times when we investigated sexual abuse cases, we discovered it while we were investigating something else. Or emotional abuse. Which one of these do you believe is the most common? And you can just put in the chat.
So we have one response for emotional, abandonment, financial, neglect. In the chat, financial. So we have 2 for financial, 3 for financial. Looks like financial is
winning.
Is the winner.
Is the
or
winner.
Loser.
It's probably the loser. It's the fast. This is a trick question, because I like to do that. Financial exploitation is the fastest growing allegation. So and you'll see the stats when I'll show you that it's growing faster. But the most common allegation that is being reported to Adult Protective Services, and it's very similar in other national statistics is actually neglect. Neglect by self, neglect by others encompasses almost half of the amount of cases coming in. I like the person that mentioned emotional abuse, because I think that's it probably, emotional abuse is probably occurring in any case that there's a caretaker that's either neglecting or exploiting someone, because they're using a way of method to control the individual, but they're not reporting it. Which is one of the things I tell people when I do this talk is if you see someone threatening someone or talking rough to someone, if you see that in public, you have to ask yourself what's going on at home, because a lot of this stuff is happening behind closed doors. It's very dependent on someone seeing it and being alert to it, which is why I think the numbers went down a little bit in the pandemic, and they went back up when the world opened back up. Because remember, I told you, adults typically don't report themselves, other people do. So if your home health aide wasn't coming to visit you, or your nurse, or you weren't able to see your doctors, now you're doing virtual visits, some of the normal people, the normal professionals that would be looking out for this stuff during the pandemic shut down. So you're probably right, the one that said emotional abuse, but it's not recorded. The one that is most is neglect. Physical abuse, ironically, represents about 25%, and we think those reports are typically coming from emergency rooms, because it makes sense. They've been assaulted or injured in some way and they're seeking medical care, or they have someone coming to the house and the aide or the nurse sees it and reports it. The one that's the least reported is sexual abuse. I think we have a hard time imagining older adults having normal sexual relationships, let alone if a son or daughter or someone else. We just don't want to accept it can be happening. We found out, like I said, because we were investigating something else. So,
Sylvia, I have a quick question here from someone who is expressing some concern about those elders that are in nursing homes. They're very vulnerable. They were very vulnerable during COVID outbreaks because families couldn't get to them. What protocols can be taken in a situation like that?
And so it was challenging, because even so in a situation like that, and someone calls me because they have concerns, I try to figure out why they, what are the concerns. And I'm going to try to engage with the first agency that I'm going to probably work with is the long-term care ombudsman at the regional level, because their main job is to advocate on behalf of residents in long-term care. So I can't go see them. So I'm going to let them know, or I reach out to the health department, because the health department oversees the facility as well as regulates the facility. But if I have concerns, why I have those concerns, maybe I can get one of them to go out. They usually don't tell the facility. So if the health department is going out, they're not going to tell them who they're seeing. But if they want to review their medical records, they'll probably give them the names of like 5 or 6 patients, so they don't know who exactly they're interested in. But that's a good question, and it was very challenging during the pandemic, because even the long-term care ombudsman wasn't going out there. They were doing telephone follow-up, and I'm not a big fan of telephone work with older adults, especially if they're vulnerable and they can't speak for themselves, and so they're dependent on someone else. And what if you're asking the bad guy to be the person to check on them? I mean, clearly it's a concern, but hopefully now that we have opened back up, we're going to want to use those systems as much as possible. And if we think a crime occurred, I'm going to definitely notify the Attorney General's healthcare fraud section.
So just to close the loop on that, and I know that you gave us all of the different agencies that are involved in elder care, whether it's facilities or whether it's ombudsman. So as a typical citizen, private citizen, if I see a situation and I want an investigation, I don't have to particularly, not that I don't want to, but I don't need to call you to get entree into that system. Isn't that correct? I could go directly to that list of agencies that you gave us, and I can make the call to the individuals or the organization that checks on facilities, and I can make that report to the ombudsman, correct?
Correct. And that's why
perfect.
Yeah. And that's why by having the indicators that we're reviewing, again, the more specific you can be, the better. But I will tell you this about the ombudsman. Their job is to advocate on behalf of the older adult. So if you call them and share your concerns, they're going to go out and talk to that person. And again, you're back to, what does that person want? Do they perceive this as a problem? And so the ombudsman takes their lead not from you. They're going to take it. You're going to notify them, but what happens next will depend on their encounter with the older adult.
And I think that's something that's very difficult for us when we see someone that is being taken advantage of, is to step back and to remember that unless some other evidence or situation is presented, that individual has the right to make those choices. And as you said earlier, good choices and bad choices. And
Yes.
I think that makes it much more difficult for people when they're trying to take care of older individuals, because they do have those rights.
It is very challenging. And sometimes I get calls when they've tried to do that and it's still happening, because sometimes someone like me can persuade them to take another look, or might ask them questions about evidence that maybe hasn't been looked at. But and this is one of the reasons why in Ohio, I'm an advocate, and I would like us to advocate for Adult Protective Services to be able to investigate those cases. So I'm advocating for that change, because Adult Protective Services doesn't necessarily need consent from the adult to investigate. They follow the evidence, they follow the risk. And so in my opinion, I would like us to continue to advocate for APS to be able to have that added to their, in most states they do, over half of our 50 states. So I'm not asking for something unusual. In America, over many states, over 50 states, I mean, over half of the 50 states, Adult Protective Services already has that authority.
So what I'm going to do right now, it is getting very close to the time that we should be concluding. I'm going to ask Sylvia if you are willing to go ahead and continue with your presentation. And for those of you that can't stay with us and continue with the presentation, I will remind you that the presentation and all the resources and the slides will be posted on the MWR webpage. Sylvia, if you're available to keep going, then I would say we'd love to have that happen.
Yeah, no, I had you down. We started at 11. Oh, okay.
So it's been a lively discussion with lots of information in the chats, and that makes a good presentation, and okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll keep going even if everybody else drops off, because it is being recorded. So I would appreciate people staying, but because I think it's important for them to know more. Like this next slide, I was going to talk to them about how to make a report. And so some of this I've already mentioned. The more information you have, the better. And if you know information about who you suspect might be the caretaker, or is the caretaker also the alleged perpetrator. That's really important, because if you believe the person that's providing the care is also the person who's hurting them, that's important information. And we talked already about why you suspect it, and the more detail you can provide. And the nature of the extent, is this a new problem? Is it getting worse? How long have you been aware of it? Those things are important. So technically, APS is one of those systems in Ohio, like a lot of things, because we're a home rule state, where it's state supervised, county administer. So you can make the report by contacting the state number. I have it there for you, that 1-855 Ohio APS. But it's going to go right to your local municipality. It's not going to stay. The state does not investigate. It's going to go right to your local office. And they recently added, which I think is a nice resource, they've added an online portal. So those of you who may know someone, you might live in Cuyahoga, but the person you're reporting on is another county. So the portal gives you the ability to make the report at any time of the day, which is important. Some of you work third shifts or whatever, or you work during the day, so you want to access this later. Or like you're the young millennials who don't want to talk to people, you just want to make it online. You can make an online referral. It's going to go right to the county. I want to note, because the adult's not going to make the call most likely. So what are you looking for? And these are some of the changes. And typically people, when they're calling, is because they're noticing something new, a new best friend, The physical appearances of the individuals changed. You know, they used to be very well kept, and now they're wearing, you know, 5 outfits in the same day, because that might be a flag for memory loss. Any changes in personality, someone who used to be very pleasant, all of a sudden, you know, people can change, the personality can change because of a comorbidity occurring, but also if somebody's taking over them and forcing them, you know, dominating them, it could affect their personality, and they can become less pleasant. And I always tell people, if you're going out into the home, yeah, any changes in the home. And these are all warning flags that maybe something's going on. More specifically, in terms of signs, is that if you think someone's not being taken care of, the disappearance from contact is huge. There's actually some perpetrators will use that because they will isolate the individual from their family members and friends. So you got to be careful with new best friends, someone new person comes in, and all of a sudden the patterns change, the behaviors change. That's a red flag that something could be going on. But social isolation is huge, and this is what we saw in the pandemic. We actually told them to go home. The bad guys knew it, and the scammers knew it, and that's why I believe the romance scams and things like that. And we can talk about scams in another talk, Michelle, because that's a little different than APS. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But if you see bruises, you know, clothing's a big thing. So I've seen people wear the same outfit, you know, and they don't realize there's a lot of stains because they're not realizing that they put on the same clothes, or you know, they're not changing. If they're malnourished, if they're, you know, hungry, if you're seeing changes in their mental status, if they appear to be fearful. I've had situations where I'm interviewing someone, and their son or daughter or whoever walk in the room, and their demeanor changes quickly, because all of a sudden it could be eye contact, it could be someone putting their hand on their shoulder. It's like a very subtle, you know, be careful what you say. I'm right here and I'm listening, but I'm picking up on, okay, this person just changed totally with this person coming in. So we don't have financial abuse, you know, unpaid bills is huge, as well as, you know, people will tell me that, you know, they're no longer seeing the statements because, you know, someone's having that diverted, the bank statement somewhere else. But financial abuse, one of the things when we got calls, one of the first things we would check is who owns the house, because that's who owns the house. It's very often the house belongs to the older adult. Who owns the house? And are there any second liens or second mortgages being placed on it? Because you know, that is way too common, where somebody else is maneuvering and changing things, and they're trying to steal the house. So that's in our office when we got the call. That was one of the first things we would check. So changes in documents. So the biggest one that I would see, and I want to alert you guys, our power of attorneys are very dangerous. They're very well under the right circumstances to the right individual, but oftentimes a new power of attorney is a sign that something's amok. And so when I you know, whose idea was it? Who found the attorney? So is this decision being made all by themselves, or is it being influenced? Power attorneys, in APS, we call them licensed to steal, because typically when someone says I'm the power of attorney, many of us will stop talking to the older adult and turn their attention to the person who's a power. And one of the things that we train about is you really need, most power of attorneys do not go into effect until we have evidence the person's incapacitated. So, you know, the due diligence, if someone tells you that a power of attorney, with the due diligence is, first of all, read it and see it, because I don't know how people lie. They don't have it. They like to say it because they know if I tell you this, you're going to stop listening to that person. But if they tell you they're the guardian or the power of attorney, you're going to want to see that paperwork, because it typically lists their authority. And we have to know what the authority is to find out if they're going beyond the scope of their authority. So that's really important. But when I interview people, we like to separate them. We like to interview the victim separately from the perpetrator. Basically, you're trying to get the person comfortable to talk to you without their perpetrator present, but you're trying to make sure the stories line up. But that's, power of attorneys are really important. And like I said, and I always got them, and I shared them with my prosecutor, because what we were looking for is, I want to see if they're abusing their authority. You have to understand what authorities were granted to begin with. So a question that I had for the group, and those of you who are still left, I think based in Ohio, and again, this is specific to Ohio, Do you think APS has a jurisdiction to investigate cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation of adults who are under the age of 60? Do you think this is true or false? And this is a bit of a trick question.
I have one true.
Mhm.
I'm waiting for some other folks. And just to give you a little bit of feedback, we still have 16 participants with us. So,
we're doing
that's
good.
Yeah, it's a topic I think that is of great interest to many of us. Okay, we have another false, as they are not considered a senior. See if we have any other.
Well, that person's very smart. So, you know, and it's in Ohio. So there is no federal definition for any of this stuff, and that's a problem. So each states are a little bit different. So the age in Ohio, we picked 60. Maybe it was consistent with the Older Americans Act, because a lot of those services kick in at the age of 60. So in Ohio, you have to be 60 years old, and it's not just age-based, and you have to live in the community, and you have to have vulnerabilities that prevent you from providing for yourself. So Ohio was very limited in their definition, is that they wanted to make sure that the adult had to be in a position where they couldn't provide for themselves. So that is why they were going to access adult protective services. So when you call, you want to be able to describe vulnerabilities to the intake workers. So whether you think the person presented as confused, if they were disheveled, so that you don't have to have a diagnosis, but what made you think that maybe they're having trouble? If you feel that they're making poor decisions, you're going to say, well, you know, I'm concerned about their ability to make decisions and whether they have capacity to make those decisions, because they're making poor decisions that have bad outcomes because this person isn't able to pay their bills, they're not able to do something. So one of the things I always tell folks when you're talking about APS is to focus on what you know, what you see, what are you seeing, but what risk do you believe that is causing? Because it's a combination of the behavior with the outcome that can lead to more dangers while you're making the report. So, because you want to focus on, yeah, there's an allegation. This is why I think abuse is occurring, because this is what I'm seeing. If we don't take action, it's going to continue. And if any of you ever have any trouble making a referral, yes, I'll make that. We help people with that, because sometimes it's the jargon, or you have information that you don't realize is important. So by talking with us, you realize, oh, okay, I should be explaining to them why I think this person's vulnerable. And that's critical. I'm telling you right now, if you tell them that if you don't know anything about the vulnerabilities, the case might be screened out because they're an adult and they have the right to make those choices. So that's really important. So actually, this is a repeat, I'm sorry. So the response times, because people are asking, I want you to, like I said, I want you to get in the practice of asking whether the case was screened in. The other thing I'm going to give you a tip is, if they ask you if the person's competent, I'm going to suggest that you not answer that question, because technically everyone, including me and you, are competent unless you know you've been in front of a probate court judge or magistrate who has declared them incompetent. So most of us, and the word competent doesn't even show up in the APS law. What it talks about is capacity and incapacity, because typically what we're questioning with these adults is when you're seeing decisions that are poor decisions, but what you're concerned about is whether or not, because there's a harm involved. They're losing money, they're giving money away, so now they can't pay for their medication. Now they can't pay for food. So you're going to focus on the problem. So you're going to suggest, I don't know if they're competent. I'm concerned about their capacity because this is what I'm seeing. I'm going to give you that tip. Don't answer that question. Once the case comes in, APS will determine whether if it's an emergency. If it's an emergency, I'll give you a good example of emergency. Someone has, in the middle of winter, the older adult has no heat, so we're concerned about their ability to sustain without heat. That might be an emergency. You're aware that they have no utilities and there's no lights and there's no way to cook. There's no way to heat the house or cool the house. In the summer, we're going to have 90, what they say, Michelle, it's going to be 97 degrees tomorrow. Older adults don't do well in the heat, and if they don't have a fan, so I bet you $1, APS is tomorrow is probably going to get some emergency calls of older adults who are living in a house that has no good ventilation and it's so hot. So if it's an emergency, they go out within 24 hours. Otherwise, it's in 3 days. They do have to have an investigation, and we prefer it's face-to-face. APS typically doesn't make appointments. When you call in an allegation, their first step is to try to go out and do an unannounced visit because they want to see if what you reported is correct. So it's typically an unannounced. This is where consult with the referent. That's actually taken right from the Ohio Revised Code. This question came up earlier. In section ORC 5101.65, those of you that like to read, it's because they're, and saying feasible is because they have the right to make the report anonymously, but they're supposed to talk to you. And in most counties, that's actually a policy. That's the first call they make back is to the referent. So I am a little concerned about that person's comment. Michelle, were you going to say something?
I just was going to say, yeah, it has to be you have to be making the report and you have to leave your name. So you cannot expect a phone call back for an anonymous tip. So if that's a concern for people, then I wanted to make sure that we let them know. You have to leave in order to be consulted, you must leave your name and a contact method.
And I was a mandated reporter for 20 years. Before I jumped into this work, I was a geriatric case manager. I used to tell my clients that I was a mandated reporter and I had concerns, and I would paint the picture that APS might be able to help. I didn't want to scare them because it's real important that we don't tell them APS is going to stick you in a nursing home because they don't have that responsibility. But I would let them know because I didn't want to violate my trust. I wanted them to know that that was a requirement on my part, but I also wanted to know because I have concerns, I believe this organization can help. I would couch it that way when I was a mandated reporter. And the other thing the law says is that when they're investigating it, they're really supposed to talk to anyone who has information. This is why the more information you can provide them about who's involved and who isn't, but because I can follow up with, or they can follow up with, if we know that they're maybe on passport and they might have a passport case manager, or they have a mental health case manager. So the more information you have about who's involved at intake is important because it kind of sets up the investigation in terms of who they should be talking to. But it does say that in the law. One of the differences with what the law says and why it might be different in your county is going to be covered in a minute. But it really has to do with funding, which we're going to talk about in a second. This last bullet is important because I told you APS, those laws are private. The only way you can get that information is a subpoena. And even the person themselves or their attorney cannot find out who made the report. That information is redacted by the prosecutor who, when I was in Cuyahoga, she reviewed every subpoena I got to make sure that the information was being requested. In fact, did she have to submit a request to squash it, or because we only disclosed what we had to or being told to. But they do have to tell the person the nature of the report, because they have the right to know. So they have the right to know why I'm there. So if I'm investigating a physical abuse case or an exploitation case, so I tell people sometimes the nature of the report is pretty specific. So sometimes the adult thinks they know who made the report. You don't know how many times someone would call me when I was a chief telling me tell me who ratted me out. And I had to politely tell them that that information I can either I couldn't disclose that information. I can either confirm or deny it. And then instead I would explain to them our role, that why we were going out and what we were trying to do. I would try to deflect them into just kind of explaining why the sooner you let us in, the sooner we can find out what's going on and offer support. I would try to handle that question that way, but I would have to explain their rights, that the person's right is confidential. The person's confidential. So the job of APS, typically they're focusing on is balancing the person's autonomy. What are their wishes? What do they want? with their right to safety, and it's kind of a balancing act. But we try to keep, the Adult Protective Services tries to keep the person in the community for as long as possible. So they use the term least restrictive. So how can we alleviate this allegation? How can we alleviate what's causing this least restrictively is going to be the first thing they go to. They're going to eventually, least restrictive for an individual might be a facility that's getting protective care, and it might be a guardian to make decisions, but they're going to start with the less is best approach. And this is going to also be impacted by your community, what resources where they live, what resources are available. The risk of the older adults, I kind of talked about it. Here's your slides, but number one is social isolation. So we know that social isolation is actually it's critical that, and this is the best way to protect people, is to make sure they're connected, and we learned this firsthand during the pandemic, what being socially isolated could do to you. Cognitive impairment is still high. It's obviously that can make you more susceptible. What we learned, people are social human beings, and we need other people. And this is why some of those scammers that you were mentioning, the romance scam became huge under the pandemic, is because people were home alone, and we all need that special someone, and this person's calling them, promising them love and a relationship. So they promise them those things before they build a relationship of trust, and next thing you know, they're going after the money. The other thing right here is the shared arrangements is the other thing I saw a lot, is people who were asking other folks into their lives because they needed someone to help them. And the arrangements were made with people who were not good, or they sought them out. I remember I had one guy, he was a former Marine. He was up in the Cleveland area, the snow. The bad guy, that relationship started with him shoveling his walk. Next thing you know, he's in the house. And I remember one day getting a call in the middle, it was 12 o'clock at night, and the East Cleveland police is calling me because they were doing a home invasion because there was a drug ring running out of this guy's house. And they used him, but they developed that relationship. It started very nice, and it led to this terrible thing. Luckily, the police called me, and we actually had them take that gentleman to the hospital, where he ended up having, because they were neglecting him and he had missed some dialysis appointments, we were able to separate him very quickly from his bad guys, but also address his health problems. And we that to me is a success story. We actually reconnected him to his brother. But that case was referred to us a lot, but it finally reached a point where it was a crisis, and we were able to intervene. This slide is letting you know about 60% of the cases involve women, and women still live longer than guys. A lot of the times the resources have been eating up with their spouse. So by the time they're older, they have less resources. They're more vulnerable. So we know that right now men do get abused, but we know that 60% of the cases coming in involve women and over the age of 80. Complications, when we're dealing with older adults, what makes these cases hard is oftentimes the adult, they want you to figure out how to help them without necessarily wanting to file charges. They don't want to sever their relationship with their son or daughter. 90% of elder abuse cases are committed by someone known to the victim. It's a family member or someone that's close to them, and they have a relationship. So what makes these cases so hard is, in many of these cases, the adult is not working with you. You're trying to figure out how to protect that individual without using them as an active, being a witness to the crime. It's very challenging. We talked about them suffering physical and emotional losses, and to the point where they die faster, they go to nursing homes faster. And then we know that many times they become very depressed because they realize, they wake up, I use that term, someone who's been taken advantage of, they tend to blame themselves, and then will actually affect their mental status, because how can I be so stupid? How did I fall for that? So I always tell my families, when they identify the victim, make sure you take them to the doctor, and they start addressing that right away, because you'll see sometimes these victims, once we start helping them, they'll deteriorate because they start blaming themselves, not the bad guy who took advantage of them. They blame themselves for what happened to the point where it's detrimental. The other big complication is the whole issue of competency versus capacity. So the one thing these two things have in common, these concepts, is that they're both assumed. And I wanted everyone to know they're not necessarily the same thing. So competency is a legal term, and everyone's competent until we proved otherwise. And typically we're addressing capacity has more to do with the clinical presentation. So that's why I always tell people, if you're concerned about decision making, you're probably concerned about capacity and ability to make decisions. You're not necessarily saying they're incompetent. And I can talk to you about this for hours, because we address this all the time. I just wanted you to have the basic framework that they have. It is assumed, so we have to have evidence to prove otherwise. So those pictures that you may or witness statements can help us determine that maybe there is a capacity issue.
Sylvia, we have a comment that's in the chat box, and I'm going to recommend that that individual contact you. I'm not sure that you can answer the question without having more information, but I will tell you the question is, if the abuser uses up their finances and puts, I would assume, the senior in a home, can you pull them out after they've been put in a home? So can you pull them out after that? Or do you still need permission? Do you still need the abuser's permission? So it's looking to me as though this particular comment is encompassing that the person with control is the abuser.
Yeah, so what is going to make that complicated is whether or not that abuser also has legal, is he a guardian or a power of attorney? So did he misuse his authority to do that? Because if he legally did it, we're going to have to prove that it was a misuse to be able to undo it. So that case would be, yes, you're going to want to contact me, but
so to that individual that asked the question, the information was earlier in the chat as well, so that you can contact Sylvia, and it will also be the last slide of the presentation. And if you want to contact me privately, I'll be glad to send that information directly to you.
But so I'm just letting you know, it's going to be very hard to undo that if they have legal authority. And if they don't, yeah, we can get them out. But if they actually if they're the guardian, or if they're the power of attorney, we're going to have proof to undo it. So that's, I'm just letting you know.
Yeah, the person says thank you, and I'll make sure that that information gets to them.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not going to do the chat, but I have this question out here because I want you to realize this, because this question is designed. It says 20% of older adults age 85 have dementia diagnosis, true or false? The answer to this question is actually false, because it's actually much higher, because it's actually closer to 50%. So once someone reaches the age 85, there's a 50% chance that they're going to have some type of decline of cognitive. So, and this is important, because when someone's a victim of crime or abuse, one of the things I ask a lot is, how old are they? But I'm also, a lot of people assume people are okay. I don't know how many times I hear, oh, they're just ornery, or they're very independent. And then I'm like, I always ask their age, but when I'm hearing the story and I'm hearing all these bad decisions, one of the first things I like to ask is about the capacity evaluation, not because I want everybody to be incompetent, but because I know that as a social worker, to solve a problem, I don't want to make assumptions. I want facts. So I want to know someone's true functioning, so we can develop a plan that matches them. And if they are incompetent, yes, I'm going to want to go in that direction to protect them. This slide we've talked about a lot, but this is your slide that talks about self-determination and how we have rights in America. Adults have right to make choices. We do have to balance that with societal norms, because I love to say, well, they have the right to self-determine. And I always remind people, yeah, we have the right to self-determine, but we make those concessions every day. You make those concessions. When you go to the grocery store, you follow the line, you pay for your stuff, run out the door. If you're driving around, you follow the stop signs and the red lights. Why? Because if you don't, you might get a ticket or cause an accident. So you're not exercising self-determination every minute of your day. You're do things that's expected of you. The one thing that I caution folks all the time is with self-determination is it's undermined when the adult lacks capacity. So when someone lacks capacity, they don't have the right to self-determine. So in some of these cases, when I get involved, I do ask a lot of these questions because I want to make sure we're not making the assumption that they still have capacity. And I'm also asking a lot of questions about whether we believe they've been unduly influenced, because if the bad guy came in their life and isolated them and took them away from their family and friends, the person may look like they're making decisions on their own, but in actuality, they've been influenced by the bad guy. Undue influence is a very complex phenomenon that actually occurs in many of our older cases where there's a perpetrator involved. And these cases are very challenging. This is like these cases are very challenging because you have to prove this. You have to prove the pattern. When did they meet? How did things happen? These cases are very challenging and would require, if you're interested, we can have a training one day on how undue influence works. But it impacts legal consent. And this is where we spend a lot of time with these cases. And, and I asked that question, under what circumstances did the adult consent? I'm actually trying to figure out, were they forced? Were they lied to? Were they manipulated? Do I think they have capacity, or do they think they're unduly influenced? All of these things can render that consent invalid. So it could, in essence, if it makes it invalid, maybe we can take action. These are the stats I wanted to show you. So here's back here, these early ones in 2017. This red one represents neglect. So for those of you who had this question, I'll show you, neglect is by far the most common. Green is exploitation. So you could see that in the last couple of years, it has grown. The cases coming in for exploitation has grown exponentially. And it's growing in Ohio. I mentioned to you the problem's getting bigger. It has to do with the reports, more mandated reporters. And the other thing that happened in Ohio is the definition of exploitation was expanded, they took the word caretaker out and put person. So it really expanded the cases that met that criteria. This is the biggest problem we have. And those of you that are able to advocate, there's not one state in America that has enough funding for adult protective services. Here's Ohio. We just passed some legislation. So right now, every county only gets $65,000 a year for their budget in this line item. That's not a lot of money. That's enough to pay for one worker. So what Ohio is, so it's a state funded, it's a state program that's asking the counties to figure out a way to fund it. So some counties have a lot of other resources like senior levies, and Cuyahoga is a good example. We had a health and human service levy. So we had a big into the state. Cuyahoga still has a lot of money in APS. If you're a little county like Allen County or Putnam County, and you don't have a senior levy, you only have that 65,000, well, you probably have one worker. And that's where you're seeing the differences. The law might be the same in every county, but it might be implemented slightly different in your county. It might be because of this problem. But here's an area that you can all help by writing your legislators. We need our Ohio legislators to be aware that we need to continue to support an expanding funding to the APS line item so we have adequate safety net for all seniors, regardless of what county they live. The perpetrators are bad. I'm going to just go through these real quick because I know we're running out of time, but I want you to know that perpetrators, any one of us can become a perpetrator with the right circumstances. One of the things that we've learned in APS in the early days, we thought perpetrators were stressed out caregivers. And what we're learning, that's not necessarily true. There's some people who are very intentional in how they control their victims. So anyone can become a bad guy. And I know this to be true. And I used to be a regular social worker, and I used to tell my friends when I do this talk, I go, you call them caregivers, I call them perpetrators. Because one of the things we want to make sure that when we're interviewing people, bad guys are very good, very good and getting you to listen to them and not what's going on with the victim. So one of the things we teach people is to make sure you want to talk to the perpetrator and see if we can educate them and get them to do different things. But when you do that and they're still doing, like you're talking about respite, but they're not taking advantage of respite, you're talking about services that they can do to make things change and they don't take that, that's typically a sign that something's going on, that either they themselves are incapable of being a caretaker, because I've seen that happen, or they're intentionally not being able to provide because they're benefiting from it. And so I don't want you to focus on whether the intentions of the bad guy. I do know it's easier to fix a case when the person didn't mean to do it, because they respond to the education, the resources being provided. It's harder to solve a case when you're dealing with someone who's intentional, because then you're looking at, how are we going to separate this? Are we going to use legal resources? How are we going to separate this? Becomes challenging, and that's why it's important that we work together. And looking at the reasons why they're doing it, because if it's someone who's benefiting from it and that's why they're not stopping, is because they don't want to stop. They are benefiting from the money that's coming in, then the control they're exerting.
And Sylvia, I know that you're trying very hard to be respectful and push us on through your slides, but I do have a question that was submitted in the chat box, referenced the increase that you were showing in elder abuse. And the question was, what's the horizontal axis metric? Was that the years? Let's go back and take a look at it. Yes.
Yeah. So the years are down here. So this is 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21. I didn't put it on there. This is the thousands. So this is the numbers. So did I answer the question?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
And the other comment was a shameful trend. So
it is, and it's getting, and part of the problem is we have to send out a new message. First of all, we need to send out a message that we want to hold people accountable. But the money, I think Ohio, so the 1 year in 2015, we had a 1 year appropriation where we had $10 million in 1 year. And we got all excited, those of us who were doing the work. But then they're like, oh, it's only 1 year. So that particular year, they, what do you do? Because you can't get staff, because how are you going to pay them the next day? So they did a lot of things to like education and training to, so they upgraded their training, the courses for APS worker and supervisors, did things that were an investment. They had some grants that went out to the counties, so the demonstration grants. There was interesting things done that year, but then we dropped right back down. We just passed the legislation this past July. Yes, that's why I know, because I did a lot of advocacy with my colleagues. We advocated and still advocate. We probably need closer to $20 million in this line item to have every county have an adequate safety net. So the best way to do this, though, and this is where I think you can be helpful, is I think writing to your legislators about this problem. Most people do not realize that Ohio is putting such a minimal amount of money in this line item, and yet Ohio is aging as a state. So right now, 1/4 of our citizens are people 60 and above. So we want to treat our elders the same. They should have the same resources that we have for kids. I've been passionate about this effort for a very long time, and if you look back far enough, there was a time where they actually zeroed out the line item until people like me started advocating again. And back in 2008, we were only giving the counties $30,000. So clearly Ohio needs to do a better job acknowledging the needs of our older adults, in my opinion. So this is a wheel that the abuse and later life wheel that our friends in domestic violence are actually teaching us about the types of tactics that perpetrators use to control their victims. So it's kind of been adapted to an older victim as opposed to a domestic violence. But this was important because, as I mentioned, when I was a young social worker, we thought that people abused only because they were stressed out, they were burnt out, and we've learned from our colleagues that that's not necessarily the case. That some people abuse because they're benefiting from that relationship. So they use different tactics to control their victim. And this is why that one person was smart when they said that emotional abuse is probably the most common. And I'm like, yes, because that is the emotional abuse, humiliation, threatening is how how the victim's controlled, so the person gets what they want. And you don't know this until you actually try. You should tell my workers, we're going to offer the interventions. It's either going to solve the case or we're going to understand what we're looking at, because you're going to learn you're dealing with an intentional abuser because you've tried to solve it by providing resources, and it doesn't work. But what can you do? Because I always like to end my talks with positive notes. What can we do about this problem? Well, first of all, we have to recognize it's happened. So I want you to, if you hear an older adult tell you that they're being neglected or exploited, we're going to want to take them seriously, even if we think they have dementia, because they typically don't tell us. We have to pay attention to the victim, because they're the target. These perpetrators are very clever at making you believe that somehow the victim had something to do with it by blaming them, and that they're typically isolating the patterns are directed towards the victim. And of course, if we don't do something, if we don't try to do it, we don't try to bring it to anyone's attention, victims suffer. We talked about that today. We also don't know, if they did reach out to help, are they going to have reach out again? Because that's a hard phone call to make, to tell someone that you think your son or daughter is hurting you. And we typically only have one shot at it when it's the victim. If we don't do anything, the bad guy isn't held accountable, and they send the wrong message that it's okay to do this. And if there's no consequences for their actions, we're giving them a pass. So these are all possible dangers. The key to solving this is, first of all, days like today, having an education about it, so we're recognizing it. I do think that checking on the older adults in your life is vital, especially tomorrow being Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Reaching out to them, checking on, not just calling them. Stop by if you can, because if you call them, they're going to tell you they're fine. They don't want you to know what's going on, so they're going to tell you they're fine. So I think it's important that we take the time to visit with them to make sure they're fine. Look at the refrigerator, look at their medications. Are they taking their meds? Do they have food? It's important that we actually lay eyes on them, or you or someone you know, to do that. Recognizing Elder Abuse Awareness Day is important because we want to recognize and it's legitimizes the day. We want to foster a culture within your organization where you work, just like today. It's very important, and I'm thankful that Michelle reached out to me, because all organizations should be having this talk with their people. All of you have older adults in your life that you can reach out to and take care of. This is not neighbors. So I think this is important, that it's not just for social workers and nurses, but everyone. This is everybody's business. And if you see something, say something, because you can't guarantee it's going to stop, but you can certainly create an opportunity for the abuse and neglect to stop. So these are some of the things we've already talked about in terms of reminding you that a lot of this is family members, and we want to make sure that we don't excuse and justify the older adult's behavior. So I'm going to see if there's any last questions that I didn't get to pertaining to anything from the topic today. I'll take questions while I leave. My slides were given to Michelle, so you'll have a chance to get my slides and then my contact information. So I'm going to leave that up while. If anyone has any questions, you can see my email address. You can call, or that is my actual phone number. You can reach me directly. The 647 is the Elder Justice line. Attorney Yost has the help center that's managed 12 hours a day. So that's how to get a hold of me, but I'm going to stop talking and see if there's anyone who would like to ask a question.
Well, I just want to let you know we did have a question, and which I think is a great question. Do you know of a state that does fund appropriately elder services, and that we could use as a model? So is there a state that's doing it right?
So for me, the state that's probably that is trying to do it right is probably Texas. And the reason Texas has a very robust adult protective services was actually that there was a class action, it was a lawsuit. They had a terrible system. People would knock on the door, are you being abused, neglected? And no, and they would walk away. So there was actually a lawsuit that was a class action lawsuit that took place that forced Texas to invest in their program. So they have a very robust APS. They have a very robust quality assurance program, and it's monitored closely. Ohio is trying to develop a quality assurance. I think it's really important that those of you that are managers know that quality assurance isn't all bad. It tells you what you're doing well and what needs to get better as managers. You would want to know that information. But so something like that can happen in Ohio, Michelle. Because we've been relying on this system for many years and kind of saying, well, we're doing the best we can with the money we have, which is, it's okay to say you're doing the best you can and at the same time advocating for change, but we have to, there's so much, we need more people advocating that we need a legitimate safety net for older adults. So I think right now the key for Ohio is days like today where you're educating people about the problem and how they can help, and contacting your legislator is an easy thing that most of us can do that can actually help with this problem.
And then I will give you a little bit of feedback that someone put in the chat, which is that they feel that being a survivor of abuse makes them notice the signs more often than someone who has not been abused. And that's a comment that was made. And then also, thank you so very much, which is directed at you.
Thank you.
The information, I will say, we'll leave things going just a little bit longer. So if there are other questions, I know sometimes in cyberspace, it takes a little bit of time for information to travel where it needs to be. But I will take this opportunity before people start dropping off to thank you, Sylvia, so much for your time, your presentation, and your passion.
Oh, thank you.
A long time ago, someone told me that you can teach anything but passion, and and that passion is what moves the world forward. So thank you for your dedication and your passion over the years.
Thank you.
I do have another comment that is in the chat box. It says, it's unfortunate that all this comes down to money. I contacted the legislation and the ombudsman with the issue with my dad. Nothing was done, no calls returned. So to the person that posted that, again, if you did not get the direct telephone number or the information so that you can contact Sylvia, if this is still an ongoing situation, please contact me and I'll make sure that you have that information so that you can do a direct contact. Another comment directed at you, Sylvia, is great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, all of the information will be available via the DSCC-MWR seminar archive page. So you all can reference it, you can share it, you can go back and review it. The full slide presentation, the recording of the presentation, as well as all of the wonderful resources that Sylvia gave us should be posted within the next 2 days.
Yep.
The only other thing I would ask, and this is just a housekeeping thing on my side, several times in the chat, I posted the link for an evaluation of this particular seminar. That's how we make things better for you all. That's how we improve things and make sure that as service providers, MWR is meeting your needs. And in order to do that, we need to know what the topics are, what the information is that you are most interested in. So if you have a chance, it would be wonderful to just drop an ICE comment and let us know that we are meeting your needs. And if you have ideas for topics in the future, please let us know that, because this topic came about because of a suggestion that was made. I will tell you that it's being shared across the enterprise of DLA, and it's meeting the need of not only providing us information, but also it was deliberate that we are having this particular seminar in this particular month, because whatever we're presenting on is usually something that happens all year long. But by having months and days that draw attention and awareness to particular topics and issues, we can focus and provide the best information possible during those awareness months. So I will say thank you again to Sylvia.
Thank you. You're welcome, Michelle.
And thank you to all of you that joined us. The way we make things better is by having knowledge. And so I'm very pleased that you all joined us. Have a great day.
Thank you, Michelle. You too.